We've had applications for different events. People have said this is collaboration is something they really want to work on. In recent interviews we've done on learning about the needs of the network and what folks are interested in, it comes up again and again. And Russ, who will introduce shortly, offered to share his experience and vast tool and skill set on collaboration. So we're excited to have so much interest in many of y'all joining today. So we'll do some, as I said, we'll have some interactive parts where you can share your questions and share your experience through Slido, as well as some presentation. And this is a 90-minute call. It should be on the invite just to make you aware of that. So we'll try to mix up the format and how things are going at different times. But Russ, if you want to share the slide, I can go over the flow for today. So we're going to start with really you sharing your own questions and or experience of what you think it takes to collaborate effectively. So a lot of you are in networks and collaborations right now, and that's who we're gearing this towards, is folks that are actively doing it and looking for ways to do it better. And then Russ is going to share a framework on the 4 agendas in collaboration as a way to think about and a way to place different aspects of it and think about where you are in your own. And then there's our agenda. And then we'll get into, once we've gone over those 4 agendas, what are some of the blockages or places that you're feeling stuck? And then we can dive into that specific part of the agenda. And then we'll hear your reflections and questions before we close. We are recording, okay. So I want to introduce Russ, and then I'll hand it over to him. So Russ is the founder of CoCreative, which is a consulting and training organization that focuses on systems change through collaboration, and has supported the development of over 40 multi-stakeholder collaborations focused on social and economic equity, as well as ecological sustainability, and then also quite a few in the sustainable and regenerative agriculture space. Russ is currently supporting the FSLN, helping us explore the evolution of the network through member input, and also tools like we're going to talk about today about the 4 agendas and where we can best use our energy. So happy to hand it over to Russ.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to see everyone today. We're having a flash flood warning here in Washington, D.C. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it's really dark right now. Hopefully you can see me well enough. So I'd like to do some connecting of who's on the session before we jump in. And I'm going to invite you to a poll. So if you could, on your iPad or your tablet or computer or phone, open a web browser and browse to slido.com. When you get there, you'll be prompted for an event code, and the event code is FSLN. I'll also put a link into the chat here in Zoom that will take you straight to the poll. And then when you get to Slido and enter the event code, you'll see a few questions there. This is just to get a sense of who we are as a group. If anyone's having any trouble getting into Slido, you could chat to us if you'd like in Zoom. All right, so we have 21 people responding so far, 23. You're gonna hear my dog in the background, by the way, probably especially because there's a storm. So what's the primary focus of your work? We've got some coalition building, economic development through farmer support, You could review these on your device if you'd like as well. I just found it really helpful to get a sense. I know in FSLN, there's so much diversity of areas that people are working on. Someone's working on creating more effective organizations through a trauma-informed healing perspective, which we are really into. So now I'm really curious who that person is. Work on food systems, sustainable food, motivating program implementation, community development, supporting the FSLN, equitable food access, beautiful work. And fisheries. All right, let's see what we have next here. Where are you joining from today? Looks like we have many parts of the US here. A few folks from Georgia. Wow, Georgia is really represented here today. Michigan, several folks from California, and we have a visitor from Ireland. Great. And then the last question was about a value that you consistently express in your life and work. Equity, I think, in FSLN is a theme. It's a recurring theme that comes up every time we do a poll. My guess is we'll see it a few times here. Justice, joy, resilience, authenticity a couple of times, connection, honesty, more authenticity, more empathy. Beautiful. And dependability. That's a really dependable value. I like that. All right. Thank you for sharing. I want to jump into another poll here in Slido. And this one is less about introductions, and it's more about drawing on our collective experience. So if you go to Slido again, the event code is FSLN at slido.com. This question is, what does it take to collaborate effectively for systems change? So if you could just enter one item per submission. I think you could submit multiple times. Let's just get a sense of, from our own experience, we all have experience with collaboration. What did it take? What were some of the success factors or key ingredients? And you can upvote too. You'll note that in addition to submitting items, you can see what others have submitted. And I encourage you to upvote so we can start to get a sense of what items are really resonating with folks. We're getting a number of votes around shared vision. I'm wondering on shared vision, the person who submitted that, can you share kind of what that looks like to you when a group has shared vision? What does that mean to you? I'm not sure who that is.
Sure, that was me. My name is Jessica. I'm here.
Hi, Jessica.
Yeah, I'm here joining from Forterra in Seattle. My idea of a shared vision is, a lot of folks come together around a topic or issue area, but may have different end goals around what they're trying to achieve. And I think when partners come together and go through the process of really defining what their shared goals and vision are, it makes working together a lot more effective.
Thanks, Jessica. So we've got communication and transparency alone getting a number of votes. I'm wondering, someone who shared transparency, what that looks like to you. Could you share that? And you may have to unmute yourself.
You should see on the bottom left, there's a unmute, or you can put it in the chat if you're not able to do that.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that it's kind of openness, it's sharing of information, it's people having access to the same analysis, but also people just being transparent about their agendas and their interests and their goals, things like that. We'll see if others have other takes on that. Communication, relationships, easy collaboration tools. Hopefully we'll cover a few of those today. Openness and open-mindedness, listening, willingness to accept other ideas and solutions, communication, equity, not needing to win. Great. Someone said energy. I agree. I think so much of work has to do with what gives us energy and what takes energy away, especially in collaboration. Excellent. So we'll share these out. I want to jump into sharing with you what we've learned about some of what we found are key ingredients in collaborations. So these, we call them the 4 agendas. Someone asked recently, why did we call them agendas? The honest answer is we couldn't think of a better word. But also it's because when we talk about what's the agenda for this meeting, we realized that there are actually multiple agendas. And I don't mean multiple agendas like Andrew and I might have a meeting and he has one agenda and I have another. I mean that there are multiple things happening in that room that are either supporting our successful collaboration or they're getting in the way of successful collaboration. And these emerged because in our training on collaboration, we would ask people that same question we just asked you. What does it take to collaborate effectively for systems change? And people, this was Post-it time. So now it's Slido time, but when we were in the room before, people would generate a bunch of Post-its. And across many of these trainings, we saw the same 4 kind of categories of items showing up in what people submitted. And so this came out of the data that people were providing when they answered that question that you just asked. So the first agenda we refer to as the connecting agenda. And the idea with the connecting agenda is it's about trust, it's about empathy, it's about relationships. It's also about getting the right people in the room for the work. And I don't necessarily mean the people with power or something like that. I just mean, given what we want to do, who are the people who need to be contributing to the work and to the strategy? And each of these agendas we've realized later were kind of associated with a part of the human experience. So connecting, we realized, was associated with the heart. That when people are in a collaboration together and there's genuine trust and people feel like they can be courageous together as well as safe together, there's a real sense of a heart connection. So that's the first agenda that emerged out of, and we saw some of that in what you all shared around the importance of relationships, the importance of listening, the importance of let's see what else we had here. Compromise, things like that. The next agenda we refer to as the aligning agenda. And the idea here is when we are truly aligned around a shared purpose, a shared intent, shared goals, shared priorities, that is a critical element of success. Because otherwise, what's happening, we're all just shooting off in different directions. We're bringing individual agendas, even competing agendas to the table. And we're wondering why things aren't working. It's because we're really not all headed in the same direction, trying to achieve the same thing. And as Yogi Berra, one of my favorite quotesters, said one time, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So interestingly, aligning, we realized at some point, we had this experience when groups came together and they really deeply aligned around a shared purpose that was really transcendent. Like people being in the room and really committing to and aligning around something that was greater than any of us as individuals was really a powerful transcendent experience. And so we've associated the aligning agenda with the spirit. And the idea that when we truly are together working in something meaningful and of a greater purpose, it's a spiritual experience for people. And we've felt that in the room when that has been happening. The next agenda we refer to as learning. This is, I think, one of the more commonly recognized ones. People say, well, we need research, we need some data, we need to understand what's going on in the system, et cetera. But this is about not just learning about the system we're trying to change, but learning about ourselves and our roles in that system, including potentially perpetuating the harmful ways that the system is currently working. So we mostly associate the learning agenda with the head. And then finally, making, which we found might be one of the more neglected of the agendas. But this is about how do we actually build concrete solutions and interventions that are actually going to shift things? How do we design and get new policies adopted? How do we create the structures to support local food production and distribution and processing, et cetera? And so we associate this very importantly with the hands. So I'll just share a few examples of where these agendas have really shown up powerfully in the work. With connecting, which is again about connecting and trusting relationships, we're supporting a large collaboration in the electronics industry called Clean Electronics Production Network. And this collaboration includes people who are advocates and activists for workers' rights, particularly this guy who's been working for 30 years to protect workers from exposures to hazardous chemicals. And he's been campaigning and he's brought companies to the table to negotiate, and he's shamed them through a lot of press and media work around all the harm that they're doing to workers through these exposures to hazardous chemicals. And so these people who were in the room had been, in some ways, enemies. We had representatives from the large electronics companies. We had manufacturers who were producing the products. We had academics. We had folks from public sector. And then we had folks like Ted who were activists, and in his case, had been working on this issue for decades and really frustrated with the lack of progress. So this group started to work together, and it's a little bit of wariness in the room of whether or not we could really build the trust that was needed among these folks who had been at odds for so many years. But a couple years in, after one of the convenings of the network, that was a particularly powerful convening where the companies had collectively committed to eliminate the 10 most hazardous chemicals that were being used in their supply chains. That was a big breakthrough, and it had been difficult to get to that point. And Ted, in a debrief afterwards with the design team, which is what we call a version of a steering committee, Ted basically said to the others, most of whom were company representatives, he said, I have to say, one of the things that I love about this group is that we avoid roadblocks by continually committing to each other. And that was the result of really paying attention to connecting people as human beings, not as positions or roles or or anything else. But there was such deep trust now that the trust was really fueling the efficacy of the work. And then, let's see, I think on aligning, I'll just share one more example here in the interest of time. With aligning, one of the things we do around aligning is really do a lot of work on what is the actual goal of this collaboration? What's the highest purpose that if we were to achieve it, it would really be transformational. And so we put together a design team that was initiating a collaborative. And the purpose of this group was to essentially grow employee ownership in the United States. Because the more employee ownership we have, the more employees have a stake in their companies, the more equity we have, the more we're able to counter this growing wealth and income gap in the country. And so this group worked for several weeks, about 4 weeks, trying on different goals, looking at different metrics. Is it the percentage of total equity that's owned by workers? Is it the number of worker owners, et cetera? And they finally came up with a goal that they were going to start doing interviews with other stakeholders, and they were going to test this goal. And the goal was to have 50 million employee owners in the United States by the year 2050, which would be massive economic change and would massively would result in a level of economic equity that we haven't seen in decades in this country. So they were excited about this. And the first interviewer, Marjorie Kelly from a group called the Democracy Collaborative, reached out and interviewed this guy, Joe, who'd been working in that space for several decades. And she gets to the point in this interview where she says, Joe, I want to share a goal with you. This is a goal that we've drafted as a team. And I want to ask you what you think it will take to achieve that goal. I don't want to know first whether you agree with the goal or not, but if we were to have this goal, what do you think it would take? And then she says the goal, and Joe doesn't say anything. And she says, Joe, did you hear the question? He said, yeah, I heard it. And he said, Marjorie, I have a question for you. Where did you get that goal? And she said, well, she described the process the design team had used over the previous few weeks to come up with it. And he said, okay, well, I literally wrote that down 2 days ago. He had written the exact same goal. So that was just freaky, right? And that was almost like, what is going on here? And a few months later, after they launched this collaborative, Marjorie was presenting to a group of 250 leaders working on the challenge of workplace democracy. And at one point in her speech to this room full of people, she stated that goal, and everyone in the room spontaneously stood up and started clapping. So that's the kind of effect we're looking for when we're really aligned. There's energy that's created around something that's really meaningful and spiritual and powerful for people. So those are a couple of examples. One of the things we've realized about these 4 agendas is what happens when one isn't present. So on the screen here, I've taken the example of what if we were really doing well on 3 agendas? People were connected and trusting relationships. They had a lot of shared learning about what was happening in the system they're working on and trying to improve, and they're making solutions, but they're not aligned around the ultimate goal. So I'm just curious if anyone would like to unmute yourself and share what would we see if we were connected and learning together and making things, but we're really not aligned.
Abject failure.
And why so?
Sorry, I muted myself again. Because if people are not aligned around where we're headed, they're going to keep working on their own, excuse the word, agenda.
Yeah.
And not sincerely be in the game.
Yeah. we're going to have lots of divergence, lots of, I think, wasted time and energy, and eventually it will lead to burnout. So again, we could play with this where we say, well, what if they were really aligned and they're all learning together and they're all making stuff, but they're not really connected in trusting relationships? What we've seen there is eventually the collaboration falls apart because the alignment isn't really genuine, partly because to get to alignment, we have to get through difference. And if I don't feel safe in a group to express my difference, whatever that is, and it's like the experience of so many Black people or people of color in the US showing up in workplaces where they don't feel like they can bring their whole selves. So if I don't feel I can really express what I'm thinking or feeling now about the work of this group, then we're not really going to be aligned. We're not really going to be learning about what's going on. And we're certainly not going to get to making. Someone has said that collaboration moves at the speed of trust. And I think we've seen that so much in our work. So with any of these, you could take one of these agendas away or neglect it, and it can lead to failure over time. What we often see is groups will maybe be aligned. They have a clear goal that they're working toward. They've built trusting relationships. They're doing a lot of learning together, and then they're spinning. And they keep talking about more and more learning, but it's really difficult for some groups to bridge from now we've learned about the system to what do we actually do? How are we going to actually improve this? What are we going to change? What will our solutions be? So one of the things that that this equates to is when we're trying to do systems change work, it really requires engaging whole people, head, heart, hands, spirit. And so we get this sense sometimes we show up in a room, some of these things feel like they're missing. You know, there's really no heart in this work, or there's no kind of spiritual aspect to what we're doing together. Maybe it's all head, particularly in the US and some Western societies. We think that if we just if everything is clear and rational, that people are going to step in line and do what they need to do. And so we tend to favor the learning and the head and things like that. So often what we're seeing in the US particularly is things that really connect us around this spiritual purpose, things that connect us at the heart level, et cetera, tend to be kind of backburnered in collaborations. Because we'll get in a meeting and we'll say, let's get to work. Well, what is the work? Is the work building trusting relationships so that we can actually work together? Is the work really finding a purpose for our collaboration that feeds our spirits? So I'm happy to share agendas or methods that are in each agenda, but I'm curious, and we'd like to maybe just do a poll again here. I'm curious where you all are feeling challenged in your work. And so I'm going to bring up another poll in Slido here. And as you think about the 4 agendas that I just presented, in that poll, indicate in which agenda you feel things have gotten the most stuck. And when you do this, picture one collaboration that you've been involved in.
We like seeing the live results.
Well, connecting is catching up. I don't know if it's going to make it to making. All right, so we probably will see a little variation from now on, but it seems like that challenge of how do we actually make concrete interventions and solutions is a big one. Connecting people in particularly diverse groups in trusting relationships is coming in a strong second. As I noted, often, particularly in the US, learning is the one that most groups tend to really focus on. And so I've seen this pattern before where we're doing pretty well at learning. Maybe we could do better. Yeah, so we don't have a plan really for the rest of this webinar. And the plan was to see the results of this poll and then to identify areas we might focus and really dig into some methods to support these areas where folks are feeling challenged. So I'm thinking, Andrew and Annalena, maybe we focus a chunk of the time first on how do we help groups really make concrete interventions and solutions? What are some of the methods for that? And then spend some time on connecting people and trusting relationships. What are some methods for that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that would be good. And it would be interesting. I'm curious to hear maybe from a few folks that answered about making being the challenge.
Yeah.
If there's anything more to hear more about that before we get into solutions. But you can unmute or you can throw it in the chat box if there's just something to share about why you picked that one.
So yeah, where have people gotten stuck in that making concrete interventions and solutions? Or what seems to be happening that's not working? Does somebody have a specific example without outing your colleagues?
We might, yeah, maybe we just need to get into examples. But
yeah, that's the problem. People always ask us, well, can you give an example of a collaboration that failed? And I say, well, yes, but I'd have to talk about a collaboration that failed, and maybe they don't want me to talk about that.
Here's something that Kathy shared about quick identified concrete changes to make, but everything is changing so quickly that it's hard to make the workout. I can see that especially now being a challenge that whatever you were making may not be what you need to make today.
Yeah, and there's a real tension between continuing to adapt as we learn more, or maybe the context changes, and really vigorously advancing solutions. But I don't think that's an either or choice. I think it's important to keep learning and adapting and really moving solutions forward powerfully. So I'll share a few methods here, and then we could dig into some. Oops, sharing the wrong thing.
Here's a couple more examples that while you're pulling that up, Karen
Yeah.
said, a solution not in one or more organizations' strategic plan, so it's not really at the core of their work. And Malele said, spending so much time doing focus groups and surveys, you never get to action. And I think, yeah, I can easily get caught up in learning. I've had that. And then David said, a charismatic leader championing projects that people like, but not engaging the larger group.
Oh, yes. Oh, that drives me crazy. Yeah, and so let's start with that last one, because I think that's a really common dynamic where we've got a community leader, particularly, who has a favored solution. And sometimes we can look at that situation and say, well, that person is just using his, and it's usually a his, power to try to push through his favorite agenda. Often in that dynamic, there's also fear behind that, which is the fear that we're just going to sit around talking and not get anything done. And that's happened, right? In so many collaborations, we've talked about what we should do. We learn, and we can't get to concrete action. And so while that energy can be unhelpful in collaborations, it can also be channeled to okay, how are we going to get to actually what we're going to do here? And so I have, even though those folks frustrate me sometimes, I also have empathy for wanting to get to something that's real and concrete, right? So some of the methods are, I want to focus a little bit on this first one here. You could call them design criteria or design requirements. So if we were to make a new policy, rather than trying to figure out exactly what the wording of the policy should be, let's figure out what a good policy would do. What would the qualities or attributes be of that policy? And so actually, let me think of a different example. And Andrew, maybe you have another example too, but I'm thinking of like, let's say we wanted to design a farmer's market that was going to succeed where others had failed. And so as we talk about with community stakeholders why the previous farmers markets have failed, every one of the things that they say is a potential criteria for making a successful farmers market. So rather than focusing on here's why it didn't work and here's why it won't work again, we say, oh, okay, so the location was inaccessible for many of the people whom we're trying to reach. And so if we want a successful farmers market, one of the design criteria has to be, it has to be within, so many miles or whatever of this community. Or it has to be on a public transportation line, or it has to be next to a health center where people are going anyway, things like that. Andrew?
That reminded me of something, Russ, that we've used design thinking recently for an internal discussion, something that had been stuck for a while, and we kind of flipped it to say, who's it for, who are we designing this for, and just thought about the user and really putting ourselves in that person's shoes to walk through it, and helped us to see kind of the way forward. So, and that was the criteria, was what's going to be the best thing for them. But even like role-playing interviews and doing things like that to get into that mindset.
We were supporting a collaboration that actually had a food security and local food economy elements to it. But this was a different part of this. It was a very broad-based collaboration in Northern California. And this part was focused on improving third grade reading levels in this county and the nearby tribal lands. And there was a community leader who was really pushing, he had the solution. And if the funder just gave him the money, he would get it done. He would fix that situation. And we invited him to go out on what's called an empathy interview. It's also used in human-centered design. And he joined an interviewer, and he was going to be the note taker. And of course, he had been assuming that these kids weren't able to read by third grade because their parents didn't care, because they didn't have books in their homes. They needed more books. The parents needed more motivation to read to their children, things like that. So he goes in this first interview, and he walks into this home of this young single mother. And the first thing he sees is that there are books everywhere. And they sit down, and the interviewer starts asking her about her life. And she starts to describe how she's working 3 jobs. She has no form of transportation. So every time she has to go to a job, she has to somehow get a ride in this rural county. She she shares that every time she goes somewhere, she has to ask a friend or a family member to take care of her child because she has no childcare and can't afford it. And when this guy left that interview, everything he believed had been debunked in one interview. And it was a few months later, he stood up in front of 300 members of the community all of whom knew that he had been really pushing his solution to third grade reading. And he stood up in front of the community and said, "You all know what I was pushing for. I was wrong. I was also wrong in believing that I could do this myself. This is so much more complicated than I had realized." And he became a real advocate for really centering the needs of the families in the work, as Andrew was talking about. And then one of the core criteria for successful anything was, is it going to help Marcus? Because Marcus was the young infant of that mother he had interviewed. And everything became about, is it going to help Marcus? Is it going to help Marcus's mother get to her job, get more better income, get childcare, etc. Within a year in this collaboration, they had gone from having 30% availability of early childhood childcare facilities to 100% availability. So I think the other thing is when we start to get from learning and transitioning into what are we going to make, the other thing that happens there is, rather than generating a lot of ideas, a few people start asserting their ideas, and we start debating those. And so it's important to say, okay, what parts of this picture in this system most need to change? Is it policy? Is it infrastructure? Is it maybe getting some more funding into the system for farmers to deliver ecosystem services or whatever? And then we go into generating lots of ideas for how we could make those things happen. And then as a group, prioritizing those ideas. So I'll share other methods for how we could do that if that's of interest. But often where people are getting stuck is we're trying to go straight from the learning right into solutions. And all we have on the table is what a few people have suggested.
I think, Russ, since most people weren't stuck at learning, and from what I've seen and where I've been involved, there's a lot of people that have the information, have done a ton of learning. So like, do you have other ways that people can get from that to making together without one person calling it out? I think there were some in the chat that have come in too about people talking in circles about problems, like they know the problems or they have the data, they just don't know how to agree on that one solution. So what tips do you have for that?
I'll share one thing that we use a lot, and people have reported that it's super helpful in the work. Just disregard the pattern language there. It's a method we call the critical shift. And let's say you've done a lot of learning about what's going on in your local food system, and the goal is to build a stronger, more resilient, more successful local food economy. And maybe specifically the goal might be, we want 30% of products consumed in our county to be produced in our county. So more of that economic value is recirculating in the local economy. And so, and people are getting healthier food and all these other things. So we now maybe we'd interview a bunch of stakeholders. We would start to get a picture of what are the forces that are working for or against us achieving that goal. So maybe we would really have to have a local meat processing facility. Maybe we'd have to have better transportation solutions to get from farm into a processing facility and then getting out to local retailers, et cetera. So the critical shift is a way of looking at that really complex picture of what's going on in the system and saying, if we were to achieve our goal, what parts of this picture would most need to change? And the critical shift consists of two parts. It's a statement first of, as we look at the current picture of how the system is working. So for example, there's one specific part of that picture that really needs to change, and that might be transportation from farm to, or maybe it would, more likely it would be, we need a local processing facility that can sort and clean and pack vegetables and fruits, for example. And then, and so the first part of that picture would be, we lack local processing to close the loop for local distribution. And the second part of that picture would be a statement about how that part of the landscape needs to look in the future if we're to achieve our goal. So it would be, we have a cost-effective processing facility that people are able to easily access, that does high quality work and that meets all the required safety standards. So it's not saying how we're going to do that, right? It could be a public venture. It could be we get a private entrepreneur to invest in this. Maybe it's a farmer's co-op. There are all kinds of ways we could actually make that shift happen. But the point is to define the problem space. It's to say, okay, here's a part of this picture now that's not working. And in order to achieve our goal, here's how that part of the picture needs to look in the future. So one thing is about shifts is it's just a statement about how things look in a part of that landscape now and how that needs to look in the future to achieve our goal. But it's not a problem solution statement. It's not, okay, we don't have a processing facility, so Jeff and his brothers are going to build one. Right? That's an idea, that's a solution. We're not looking for that. We're looking for what needs to be the case in the future in that part of the picture. So these were some examples. In this case, this was, again, that education initiative. The current state was parents are not always seen or valued as partners in education. And the future, again, it's not a solution. It was just parents are valued, their voices are included, and they experience authentic partnerships with schools to support their children's success. And this shift in part came from parents, but also teachers who were involved in this collaboration. So they're the ones who came up with this language. But then you could say, oh, well, parents are not always seen or valued as partners in education. And someone says, oh, well, we need parents to run for school board. And then suddenly your whole collaboration is arguing about whether or not we should have more parents running for school board or how to do that or whatever. And everybody's kind of glommed onto and is debating a single solution, as opposed to getting really clear about the shift and then coming up with ideas for how we might make that shift happen. So in this case, with the good shift on the left, some of the ideas were we create social events after school where parents are able to connect informally with teachers, and teachers can form relationships with parents whose children are having difficulty. And that was really important to teachers because they felt like with some parents, the only time they talked to those parents was when their child was having a problem. And that was not a way to build relationships and to build partnership.
So as far as the shift here, Russ, I think it also seems like if people are already aligned around a vision or around, you know what brought them together, that's what they could shape that future statement on. And then is that what, when you get to making, that's what you're coming up with our solutions to that, and then picking the one to start with. That's going to get you from
Yeah.
statement 1 to statement 2.
Well, they wouldn't be the same because this is a collaboration in Hawaii, which is around ensuring that Native Hawaiian youth who are impacted by the foster system there are able to develop lasting networks of support. And so that's their goal. In the year 2023, each Native Hawaiian child and youth affected by the foster care system is connected to a lasting network of healthy, supportive, and enriching relationships. That was the goal, overall goal of this collaboration that involves about 20 organizations and about 35 people. As they thought about how to achieve that goal, they came up with, in this case, initially 6 shifts. And you can see some of those on the screen. But one of the barriers to that goal was they didn't have enough resource caregivers. They didn't have enough foster parents. They didn't have enough adoptive parents, things like that. And so expanding the number of resource caregivers in Hawaii and making sure they're adequately trained and supported and mentored to be able to support these youth and become part of their network of support was one of the shifts that needed to happen in order to achieve that goal. So they identified these 6 shifts, and these were the ones they prioritized as a group. And then they formed teams to work on each of these shifts. And then each of the teams was responsible for coming up with the ideas and the solutions to make that shift happen. So it's a way of doing strategy that's not really abstract, but it's like, hey, if we're to achieve that goal, what are the 4, 5, 6 things that most need to happen? Let's form teams around those and start to develop ideas and strategies for accomplishing them.
I like that. Yeah, getting to smaller work groups to get those things done and then come back to the whole group.
Yeah, and often we see in collaborations, Andrew, that people are trying to do everything in the whole group.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole group is good for, let's agree on our purpose, let's do a landscape analysis of what's going on in the system, of identifying and prioritizing these critical shifts. But large groups are not good for developing solutions and testing things and advancing ideas.
How big is, in your experience on those smaller groups, is it 3 people? Is there a good number that seems to really work?
On the smaller end, typically 3. On the larger end, they've been up to 12.
I wonder if we may want to move on to connecting, but I wonder if there's any other, while we're here, questions about the making stage or getting to making. You could unmute or you could put something in the chat if you have a question about what we've said. Jennifer said, I think the testing of solutions is key.
Yeah. We also do prototyping early, and I'm happy to share materials on how we do that. In fact, everything that we're covering here, we give away all our materials, so I'm happy to share those. But sometimes people have ideas, but they don't make them really concrete. And so we have 2 tools we use for that. One is we take an abstract idea and we develop it into what we call a concept. So how would it work? Who would have to be involved? What would be the core metrics? What kind of resources would it require, et cetera? And it's a simple, just a worksheet for a team to really develop an idea into something that's more fleshed out. And then a prototype is really just a cheap working model. So, hey, we want to build a food hub. Instead of talking about it, let's actually get some, let's actually draw what it would look like. What would the inputs be? What would the outputs be? Who would need to be doing what? And so we build prototypes a lot as a way of making ideas more real and concrete.
I guess I have a question around the making piece of like, once
Yeah.
you generate alignment and create some of these priorities that you feel will create the shift and then start working to make them. It feels like sometimes there's a point at which the thing that you're making sometimes overshadows the original.
Yes.
And it becomes hard to decide, like, you know, first of all, maybe we're making this thing and it would have a huge shift, but we don't have the right resources now that we've started to learn how to make it. Or we're making this thing and we get so focused on making this thing we're making successful that we stop evaluating whether or not it's making the shift that we originally designed it to influence.
Yeah. Kayla, there's a collaboration we support in the Portland area that's around basically closing the economic and racial equity gaps in kindergarten readiness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those groups was formed around a critical shift of right now, there's no accountability for how resources and money get allocated in that system of like early childhood education, kindergarten readiness, etc. And so this group formed around, and I think the future state of the shift that they formed around was money and decision making are aligned with the I'm trying to remember exactly, but it's basically that the money and decision making was aligned with the goals of this group, or was aligned with, you know, equitable outcomes or something like that. And so they had done a whole analysis, and the group started to do this mapping project just to figure out, to map where the money was coming from, who was deciding where it would go and where it was going. And that was a huge project. It turned out to be really complex because they were mapping at the state level, the county level, the city level, and they were working in 3 counties in the Portland area. And the thing they were working on, that map, became the work of that team. And they came back and the network, the rest of the network reviewed their work, and they said, this was in a subsequent meeting, and they said, that's great. That's really good. Now what are you going to do with that? And they said, no, well, this was our work. And somebody said, no, actually that critical shift there was your work. So you still have a long way to go. But yeah, that happens. And I think that's why we have those groups consistently in every meeting. Start with, what's the shift we're trying to create? And is the solution we're working on the best, most effective, cheapest, fastest way to do that?
Gotcha.
Kayla, hey, we've been going for an hour, so I want to invite everyone to stand or stretch where you are, or just whatever you need to do to move. Yeah, get some movement in. It's these, you know, virtual events are on the screen, but you're welcome to move around. Thanks, Kayla. I see her moving around there. Yeah, so just, we've got 30 minutes left. See, I can pivot here, but yeah, move around a little bit because we want to keep you fully engaged here. And I think, Russ, do you want to shift to connecting?
Yeah, and like before, I'm interested in hearing from a few people of, if you voted for connecting, what was on your mind?
Yeah, if there's anyone who'd like to, you could put it in the chat, or you can unmute and share what's your mind about connecting. And since that was one that's, I think wasn't a huge challenge, if you have a great success around connecting or something to share where you felt really connected to a group, you could share that as well. Yeah, and Kayla was saying, especially with COVID and everything being on Zoom, it's even harder to connect. I'm with you.
Yeah. One of the things we've noticed is that people, when they transition from in-person meetings to virtual meetings, maybe they were doing check-ins before, maybe they were, you know, people were able to talk more informally. But then when it went to Zoom, it was all business. And I've kind of seen that tendency. And I have to say, some of the network meetings we've done virtually in the past 6 weeks or so, people have said they were the most intimate, meaningful meetings the group has had. So I don't think the virtual space has to be more sterile or cold or distant. It can actually be a really intimate, beautiful space for connecting. And we're happy that we have a resource we could share on that too.
Anybody else have questions or concerns about connecting? You know, even now, let's see, Jennifer said, yeah, business is a big part of it. Difficulty in truly connecting. It takes time to connect and break down barriers. And I've seen that too, where you need to let everyone share, and you want to hear stories, and sometimes we feel like that's not productive, I guess. I feel like it's not getting the work done. So Kathy said many of the folks I work with are neurodivergent, and Zoom allows a more leveled communications field. Connections that were neglected in the past. So it's good to hear Zoom can be more accessible.
Yeah, hard to know who should also be a part of the collaboration. So Kathy, that's one thing we will ask the group at times. Who are we missing in order to do the work we need to do? But being clear about the areas of work, like for example, using the critical shifts, can clarify that. So if we know that one of the critical shifts is we need to develop the processing infrastructure for that local food initiative, that automatically says, you know, maybe we need some financing people, maybe we need some, you know, people who have developed infrastructure in other counties, whatever that is, right? So the clarifying the areas of work really helps clarify who else needs to be at the table.
Hey, Russ, I have a question that sort of combines maybe the two here, the Zoom and the connecting diverse people and trusting relationships. But I've been hearing a lot about like new partnerships and new collaborations that are emerging during this time of COVID. And I feel like when that happens in real life, it can take, you know, a full day meeting to start really getting into that trusting aspect and forming those relationships to start that aligning and connecting. How do you take that relationship building that might happen over 3 8-hour meetings to an online presence?
Wow,
have you come across that?
3 8-hour meetings.
No, that might have been an exaggeration, but you know, just those longer meetings that happen over a period of time.
Yeah. So the first thing is to take the time for the connecting and not get sucked into this this energy to just jump into the work. And when we introduce any kind of connecting activity, whether it's some deep introductions, some check-ins, some one-on-ones, sharing stories with one another, etc., every time we introduce something like that, we do it with confidence. Like, I don't apologize for asking people to share stories about a time they took a risk based on their values. I don't apologize for asking people to share with one another who's an ancestor whom they deeply respect and how do they honor that ancestor in their work. Right. So I think the first thing is to recognize this is a part of the work, and dedicating the time to it is not a disservice to the group, it is a service. But I think the other thing is, and that means that we're going to dedicate time, that we're going to take some percentage of each meeting and we're going to do that work. And where you're going to get the pushback is like some business leader who feels like he's really too busy to be doing that or whatever. But if you have enough of the group with you, they'll get in line, and actually they'll eventually love the connecting stuff. Did you have other thoughts, Annalena?
I wonder actually, has anyone on the call had that happen or have been participating in some of those longer meetings with partners that you haven't necessarily worked with before and have learned any cool tips or tricks you might want to share? I see Kathy here in the chat box has, asked, how do we recreate the chats over lunch? And I'm still figuring that out too, especially because not always eating with your camera on and your microphone is the most pleasant activity. So technically speaking, it's a little difficult. But I agree, we convene over food so much and in a group, and how do we recreate that in another setting that still brings in that energy and connection piece into it?
Yeah. We're experimenting with a few things, but the simple things that we've done around that are to put people in breakout rooms in groups of 3 and ask them to share something that's a little bit more intimate. So for example, that question of share an ancestor or someone you deeply respect and how you honor that person in your work. Most people want to share something like that. They want to talk about that person who really had a big impact on their lives. And sharing something like that is a first step toward having some vulnerability in the group. And I don't think you can have safety without vulnerability, without someone taking a risk and sharing something that's more personal.
Russ, do you have I saw Jennifer had asked in the chat about other prompts or entry points to help create that, like some of your favorite questions that you like to ask people?
We have hundreds, and we're happy to share them. Yeah, another is, I'll show you another take at the poll that I asked you to participate in. Let me just share it on the screen here. So at the beginning, I asked you to share one value that you consistently express in your life and work. This is another view on that rather than just a list. So even in our group here, as we look at this, we're starting to get a sense of who we are. And I don't know about you all, but I can connect with every value that I see on that screen. So just doing something like that starts to create a different context for our work together, because now I know, wow, these people have really wonderful values, and I like this group. So you didn't even have to share a story, you didn't have to do a check-in. You could literally have done what we just did there in 2 minutes. And maybe you don't use exactly that polling tool. There are other polling tools, for example. But I think allowing the space for people to talk about themselves as human beings outside of the work is the most humanizing thing we can do that really advances the connecting agenda. So yeah, Andrew, I'm happy to share a longer list here. I think one of the questions is, you put people in, say, groups of 2 or groups of 3 in breakout rooms, and they share one value that they consistently express in their work and how that value shows up.
Yeah, I think that is good for a smaller group. And David said the Slido was helpful, or doing a contact or bio sheet for a larger group too, to get familiar.
Yeah. We had a webinar yesterday, which I can share a recording of if folks are interested, with Auntie Puanani Burgess, who's a Hawaiian elder. And she said she will do introductions in a group where she passes around something, or just you can do it on Zoom, but each person shares what their internal weather is, whatever that is. And then they also share a blue sky moment, something that they hold on to when they need hope and optimism. Now, interestingly, Antipua does that before anyone in the group has said their name or what they do or who they work for. So I find that really fascinating because I haven't done that before, but I see the power of it, right? We're really connecting as human beings before we're connecting as our titles and our jobs.
Marin, did you want to share something?
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I work predominantly with immigrant-owned businesses. I do an incubator program for food businesses, caterers, food truck owners. I've found it really difficult sometimes to put this value of equity and kind of like no hierarchy with my participants, even if me and everyone in my organization is truly like presenting kind of, I don't like the charity model. And the problem I've run into sometimes is that some of the people I work with they've worked with other nonprofits, and they have this sort of like constantly, they're already bought into that model of charity. And so it's really hard to break it. What I've found that works a little bit is just taking extra time to like establish that I'm not there to like help them or solve their problems or like fix everything in their lives, that I have to almost like really almost exaggerate and use humor even about like painting a picture of like what the white savior experience is, and then just making them really clear that that's not what this is. That there's no way I can help them if they don't want to help themselves and build up their business. So that's just something, but it's very challenging to work with people that are within a system of charity and kind of disempowerment, and then try to create a program where that's not the case.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Martin. I think one of the things that we sometimes don't do when we're involved in collaborations is simply say what's going on inside of us. Like we try to fix things, we try to work around things. I think, oh, this collaboration isn't working, what am I going to do? Instead of going into the collaboration and saying, I am afraid because I don't know what to do, and I don't think our collaboration is working very well. Suddenly you've shifted the relationships, and you've also introduced some openness and transparency and vulnerability. And maybe you wouldn't say it exactly that way, but often as leaders, we think we need to figure it out. We need to know what to do in the next meeting. We need to know how to make this collaboration work better. If you're doing that, you're taking on the work of the group. But what I can do is I can go to a group and I can say, gee, folks, I'm just feeling like we're committing to things and we're not doing them. And I'm wondering if others are feeling the same way. And I worry about that. Like I wake up in the morning and I worry that we're not really moving forward. That kind of self-disclosure can be really, really powerful as a leader. And it takes guts too. I'm wondering what's coming up for others in terms of collaborations, either what's working, what's getting stuck, or just anything that's standing out for you right now. Oh, and David, we'll share how we did the word chart. There are a few tools for that.
Russ, there's a question in the registration about group dynamics and what to do in a collaboration when some people want more credit than others, and how to manage the equal sharing of that.
Yeah, so I think in collaboration as usual, there's a tendency to just have an open door policy, right? We're going to have a meeting about creating a local food hub or about food security in our county or whatever. And anybody who wants to work on that is welcome. And there are a few problems with that. One is people show up for all kinds of reasons. Some people show up because you're serving lunch at the meeting and they want to have lunch. They're not necessarily showing up to do the work and to contribute in meaningful, productive ways. So we will often, instead of that, we will start with a very small group and we'll make sure that we're aligned around our intent. And then we'll go talk to a few other people and then they'll go talk to other people. So by the time we get in the room, the people who are there for the same reason. And maybe the most powerful person isn't in the room in that first meeting, and that's okay. If that person isn't ready to work collaboratively with others to advance our local food hub or whatever the work is, that's okay. We'll get started with who we have. But yeah, we find a lot of people are bringing their agendas, including agendas around wanting to get credit, etc. Sometimes maybe that person has to be in the room, and I, as one of the leaders, will do what I call some contracting with that person. And I'll say, hey, this is how you're showing up, and that this is how that's affecting me. And it's not working for me. So, you know, that may be a courageous conversation. We also have a feedback tool, which helps people give feedback in a way that can be heard and really is more effective. But I might say, let's say Kathy, and I doubt Kathy's super disruptive in meetings, but let's say Kathy was continually interrupting people in a meeting. I might just have a separate call with Kathy at some point and say, Kathy, when you interrupted me in that meeting, it made me feel really disrespected and hurt. And then I shut down after that. And sometimes Kathy will be doing things, but not realizing the way it's impacting other people. She's not intending to shut people down or be mean or whatever. She just doesn't realize that in her enthusiasm to get her voice in, that's what's happening. So, so the feedback model can help with that, but sometimes you might need to have a couple people or somebody's peer talk to somebody to say, we need you to show up in a different way in these meetings. What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't let counterproductive behavior like that keep going for very long. Because eventually people will start to step away and disinvest from the work.
Yeah, so it's that vulnerability in one-on-one conversations too.
Yeah, and there's materials on things like courageous conversations. As I said, I could share a feedback model. But the first thing is to say, do we really need that person in the room in the first place? At least at this point. And sometimes we think we do, but we actually don't.
Russ, I wonder if you want to use that poll about reflections or, you know, to see what's coming up for people now.
Yeah. So last poll of the day, another kind of Slido thing here. This is a pretty open one. I've activated on Slido, and it's just for people to share what's coming up for you, either reflections or questions. And also, again, we can take advantage of the group here and upvote. So if, as you see what others have submitted, you can upvote those things. And again, this is a great way of getting from, what do we have, 45 people? Getting from everybody having to share the airtime and talk one after the other, which means we could probably hear from 5 or 10 people in a meeting, to using polling tools like this, we can have everybody contributing simultaneously. And the equivalent to that in in-person meetings is Sharpies and Post-its. So rather than one person contributing one idea at a time verbally, everyone can contribute dozens of ideas simultaneously. Let me just share what's coming up here. It's hard to recognize what the areas in need of support are when we're up to our eyeballs in the work. Yeah, that's a tough one. And sometimes collaborations aren't working well simply because they're under-resourced and undercapitalized. That's we're doing work with funders around really funding collaborations as part of the work, not just funding programs and initiatives. Because it does take work. If you're going to do a collaboration well, it takes time, right? A couple of people have said struggling to find people locally to collaborate with on food systems. Are others? Yeah.
I see one too about how do I become a bold enough leader to implement tools in their food council and where to start. So I think that is hard getting back to reality when you look at the tools, then you go back to your meeting or your community and Russ, any tips?
Yeah.
How do you start? What's the
How do
first
I
step?
become bold enough? To me, the first thing is the answer to how is yes. The first thing is just to try something, and that's different. You can also get a couple of allies. I don't know if on your food council you have like a steering committee or a leadership team or something, but get a couple of allies to support, you know, I want to try working in some different ways. We usually will have the leadership team review the plan for the next meeting, and that's where you could introduce some things. I would also say maybe start with some, you can do the boil the frog thing. Start with some connecting activities that are a little bit safer and less risky for people, and then move on to more challenging ones. Do others have ideas on that?
One
I
that
mean,
I've
the
heard
question of how
from
do I become a bold enough leader is obviously a question for me.
one that I like, it was actually shared in relation to music, but it was just fake it till you make it. Like imagine the best food council leader that you can, and then make yourself that person. You know, visualize yourself doing that or doing the work. It's not as fun as imagining yourself a drummer or a trumpeter, but using that to help build your confidence in doing it.
Yeah. The other thing is maybe someone else is bold enough to do that activity. Often in collaborations, you've got somebody who's a little bit more kind of risk taking, and maybe they could facilitate that part if they're into it.
Oh yeah, there's a good one at the top there.
Overcoming the burnout when work is not visible to other community members. Yeah. What do others think about that? One of the things that Auntie Puanani Burgess does is, and this takes a bit of time, but I think it's time well spent, is she'll ask leaders to create 3 maps for themselves. And it's pretty easy. You can do it in a half hour. The first map is your vision map. And it can be done with anything, pencil, pen, crayon, markers, whatever. But it's just, however you picture it, what's your vision? And what's your pathway to achieving that vision? So if you would like to have a really strong, healthy local food economy, make that as concrete and tangible as possible and start to map how you might get from here to there. And Donella Meadows, who did a lot of work on systems thinking and system leadership, she would do visioning every day. She would just vision something else she wants in her life, or you know, kind of embody her vision, or make it really tangible every day. The next map that Antipua talks about is the Kuleana. It's the responsibility map. So it's mapping all the things I'm responsible for. I'm responsible for my dogs, for making money, to paying the rent, whatever. And what's interesting about the responsibility map is you'll find things that you've been taking responsibility there that maybe you don't want to take responsibility for anymore. And you can let go of. But it also helps us get clear about our real primary responsibilities. And then the next one, and I think those two can help with burnout, but the third one is really helpful, which is your support map. And the idea with that is to map all the things that in your life that give you support. And that could be the land, a tree, animal, other people, practices that you have. But oftentimes we don't really intentionally look at our support system and really think about how we can strengthen that and how it can support us. So that vision, responsibility, and support mapping can be really helpful when we're facing burnout.
That was great. And speaking of support, I wanted to just share the link to the Food Systems Leadership Network. That's where you can find a lot of support. There's 2,800 folks already in that. That's who, you know, we're bringing you this webinar today. And if you heard about it another way or aren't a member, I encourage you to check that out and join so that you can participate in future calls like this or other online groups. That was a great segue, Russ. I couldn't miss that one. Annalena, is there anything else we wanted to say about the FSLN?
No, I think we have that in there, and we'll be, you know, continuing to explore the different challenges that are coming up through folks. And so if you have, you know, other specific asks around collaboration or other challenges around working or convening people, you know, please let us know, and we can work to put something together or bring in some other peer experts for future conversations.
We activated another poll in Slido. This is one thing I know about the Wallace Center is they're really, they use feedback. And so this is a simple poll just to get a sense of, you know, the relative value of this session.
Yeah, thanks for putting that up. Yes, we appreciate your input there or reaching out, but appreciate you all staying through here to the end and sharing. It's cool to hear your thoughts and at least see the Slido for a group. We can all realize we're having similar ideas and similar issues in our collaboration. So it is great to see that. And thank you, Russ, for sharing your experience and walking through so many of the examples of these different scenarios. I don't know if you have any closing words or last parting words for the group.
No, I appreciate people just sharing what's coming up for you. We've intentionally left this rather open rather than really structuring it. But we've made notes of the things that people asked for, so we'll share those in the follow-up.
All right, yeah, we will, everyone will get slides and more resources in the notes, so we'll get that out to you in the next couple of days. But thanks for coming, and we'll see you the next round.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.